Welcome, everybody, to Secular Soapbox, another episode. We've got a show where you're going to learn something today because this is not a typical subject. Caleb,
Yes, today we're going to be talking with a particular individual about a particular subject which you don't often hear about on these kinds of channels. Like Phil was saying, today is going to be highly educational primarily, but also entertaining as well. So we're before we spoil everything, I just want to throw this out there. If you like what you see, what you have seen, please like and subscribe to Secular Soapbox. But please also check out Skeptic Haven's network. We have several shows within the network, and please like and support every single one of us. We could all use some love. But anyway, sorry, Phil. Phil, can you hear me, buddy?
yeah, I was just going to say, I'm hearing a double here, so I can hear, but I'm hearing a double on everything, so.
No, that's fine. All right, well, how about this? Let's just go ahead and roll that intro and just get right into it.
Step 1, wake up early, gonna rise with the sun. Step 2, get some good, some food in you. Step 3, think real hard about what you wanna be. Step 4, everybody just do your thing.
Wake up, today's gonna be a good day. Wake up, today's gonna be a good day. Wake up, today's gonna be a good day. Wake up, today's gonna be a good day.
It's gonna be a good day. Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Secular Soapbox. Unfortunately, Bryce will not be joining us today, but fortunately for him, he's having a hella good time down in Vegas celebrating his birthday. So we wish him a happy birthday. Excuse me, I apologize. And in his place today, we are lucky enough to be joined by Phil from Believe in Reality. He'll be taking Bryce's place today. Today Phil and I are going to be talking with Mr. Ryan Barker. He's a student of history. He's got several degrees in history, and he's working, I believe you said that you're working towards your PH.D., correct?
Yes, correct, at Purdue University.
Generally speaking, he's a student of history, but we're going to be talking about history, but a lot about the history of exploration, and not only how that influenced history from then to now, but also how it continues to impact our how we view history and current events and science and technology moving forward. Thank you for joining us, Ryan.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely, man. I'm really excited to have you here. So, out of curiosity, I unfortunately was not in the loop on getting you involved with this particular program. Was it us that reached out to you, or did you reach out to us?
Yes, no. I met Aaron at a friend's house, and he put me in touch with y'all.
Okay.
Yeah.
Cool.
That's actually really fun. I like talking with I'm with friends of the family, if you will. Keeps things really close knit.
Yeah.
A little less formal. I have in the past, and I've been trying to become a better host, but I have, for example, in the past gotten a little too familiar with some of the hosts, calling doctors brother, for example. That's a linguistic thing that I tend to do.
Perfectly fine.
I call everybody brother, you know. But the doctors like to be called doctors, so I get that. They work long and hard for that. So,
Well, doctor's coming up real soon here for you, Ryan, so.
That's about 2 years I'm planning.
Well, considering where you started, so. Now, I mean, looking at your thesis title, and right off the bat, I want to say this is sort of an interesting sideline, because your thesis was to have good knowledge, tensions in the creation and dissemination of knowledge in Enlightenment era England.
Yep.
So there's a transition time in Homo sapiens history, really, about when we started to sort of give up sort of older intuitive ideas, and the scientific era sort of began, and this long sort of crossover. So I find that kind of a fascinating period of time, and that's really a bulk of what you've studied, the time period you've studied.
It is, and it's an interesting period where you start seeing things that look familiar. You know, you see the birth of like the scientific method as we understand it today. You see you see these ideas of fledgling ideas of democracy. You also see great horrors. You see the institution of chattel slavery in this period. You see colonization in this period. But yeah, and so it's a really interesting period to study because it looks familiar, but it isn't.
See, that's actually really fascinating. It looks familiar and yet isn't. And this ties into the overall subject of the matter, which is, I think one of the reasons, obviously, why it does look familiar is because this is, essentially where we came from. These are where our thoughts come from. So, of course, they're going to influence. Excuse me. I apparently got a little bit of a cough today. I apologize. So to me, it seems really intuitive to think that, it would seem kind of familiar, similar.
Yeah.
And so, but at the same time, very different. We were talking a little bit before the show about this particular concept. I think you called it, excuse me if I didn't write my note down proper, Terra Australis, is that right?
Yes,
Terra Australis.
Terra Australis, which is Latin for Great Land of the South.
Oh, okay. That's actually not at all what I thought that would mean. I just assumed that it meant something along the lines of like terra symmetrical or something like that.
Oh, yeah.
Because to me that was the impression that we were getting. So the gist, from what I gather, of this concept, the overarching concept, is that the ancients believed, once they realized affirmatively that the Earth was round, that there are certain implications to this belief and this knowledge, somehow, some way, it became, quote, common knowledge, I believe, that there was this concept of something like Terra Australis, which was that there was an equal amount of land mass above and below the equator. Can you explain sort of the origin of thought on that? Like, how did that become a thing? Like, where did that come from?
So it starts out as early as, and this is, primarily coming, eventually this has global implications, but it starts out with ancient Phoenicians in the 600s before the Common Era. They're the first group of sailors to circumnavigate Africa. And, if you have in your head a map of the world, well, Africa is a primarily north-south facing continent, which is helpful for this theory of continental symmetry. But they notice that as they move further south around Africa, the sun was crossing the sky in the north. And for those of us in the northern hemisphere, so North America, Europe, Asia, most of Asia, northern Africa, the very northern tip of South America, the sun crosses the sky in the south because it crosses on the equator. So if you go south of the equator, it crosses in the north. And so they were like, well, it's got to mean something. And then Pythagoras, everyone's favorite triangle guy, is usually credited as the first person to argue that, well, the Earth is spherical. But we don't know if that was actually his writings or if it was something that was just attributed to him because of his other work in mathematics. But one of the implications of this was trying to figure out, if the Earth is spherical, how does it work as an entity in space? The Greeks understood the concept of stars and the moon and basic astronomy, and so trying to figure out how does this thing float through space and keep everyone alive at the same time. And so we started seeing with Aristotle and later, writers like Ptolemy and then the Roman writer Macrobius, started trying to explain this idea, and they go, well, there has to be an equal amount of land on the southern hemisphere as there is on the north, because things tend to fall toward the center. So if there's not an equal amount, the entire planet will just topple over.
It would just spin.
Yes.
That's interesting.
And see, this right here already sounds like the birth of gravity as a concept.
Yeah. Like I said, it feels familiar. Now that said, along with this was the argument that so Earth is heavy and it goes toward the center. Rocks are heavy, they go toward the center, but air, fire, those things are light and they go up. And so suddenly it's like, oh, well, you're not talking about gravity.
I'm surprised already about this because Aristotle was a strong thinker. And it occurs to me that if you think the planet is going to tip because it's heavy on the top, then your gravity has to be sourced essentially at the South Pole on a plane that goes through the South Pole.
Yeah,
Because if it's sourced in the center, it wouldn't tip over. So is that correct? Did they actually believe that gravity came down there, or are we still talking about flat Earth belief?
Well before gravity, but it's the idea of it has to be at the center, because if it's not at the center, or if the land is balanced, then it won't matter where the center of gravity is, because the weight at the bottom and the weight at the top would counter each other.
Okay.
Yeah, and you know, right there, it's even though it's familiar and kind of close, it's also not entirely wrong either.
Yeah.
So I mean, this to me, this would also help to explain a lot of the utility behind this, and how these thoughts were able to be as prevalent as they were for so long. Because the thoughts, not only are they intuitive, admittedly, I think it's actually everything that you've stated so far. I mean, especially if I only had the data set that they had, that's very intuitive.
Yeah.
So that makes a lot of sense to me.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
so-
Like I'm sorry, but yeah, we take for granted, like we've sent probes to the edge of the solar system. We've seen the Earth from the moon. You know, we take the basic understanding of our environment for granted. There's an interesting, particularly historians of science, there's an interesting thing that we struggle with, and it's that science, and it's the problem of hindsight. So, you know, we know where you know, New Zealand is. We know where North and South America are. We know how to find these things. But if you're someone who's just kind of out in the ocean and figuring it out for the first time, that's not pre-existing knowledge. And so trying to figure out how do you define something as, you know, in the case of continental symmetry and the existence of Terra Australis, something that was clearly a scientific mistake, but is only a scientific mistake if you already know the answer.
So they knew about Europe.
Mhm.
They knew about Northern Africa.
Yep.
They knew about east of Europe.
Yes.
And basically that's it.
Yes. Yes.
Because they're not going to have. I mean, certainly there were people on the Americas, but they didn't have communication over there.
Yeah,
So they're kind of all the exploration started out from there.
Mhm.
So given that volume of mass, which is large,
Yes.
or
Yes.
surface area, maybe from
Mhm.
their perspective, they were looking for something about that same size.
Yes.
So the term Terra Australis is essentially looking for Australia.
Yes.
But
Yeah.
they didn't think of it. It's not like we think of Australia now as a thing over here, as a continent over here. They were expecting that it would be a landmass as large as the one above the equator. Right?
Correct. So for
So how-
casual reference, the modern nation state of Australia is, I think it's like 30% smaller than the United States. The number might be a little different than that, but I think it's about 30%
Right.
smaller. And so we're definitely talking about a much larger landmass.
So, Caleb, you had a good point from the mind perspective of what they knew at the time. What was how did they first start to go looking for this landmass?
Sure. And so, you know, things get kind of quiet after the collapse of the Roman Empire until the Crusades. And when the Crusades happen, you see a really massive influx of classical Greek writing into Europe, into Western Europe. And so what that leads to is the influence of Aristotle coming back and several other classical thinkers, but you know, Aristotle being the most famous and influential of these kind of has pride of place. And at the same time, so 1200s, Marco Polo writes his narrative of his travels in Asia. But he lists a bunch of places in that he says are south of China. Some of them may be completely fictional. Some of them might be like what we would think of as the region around Thailand. But these areas pop up on these early maps, and they always get placed in the continental landmass of Terra Australis. And so what we see is starting almost immediately after Columbus's first crossing, we start seeing major European countries. Early on, it's Spain, Portugal. After that, it's After that, it's the Dutch. After that, it's the English. You see the French a few times going in this, outfitting expeditions to find this landmass. The first European person to have claimed to have found Terra Australis was a French sailor named Binot Palmier de Gonville, and this was in 1503. And we're pretty sure he landed in Brazil. But
that's a great explorer name right there.
Yeah. But then 1520, Magellan finds Terra del Fuego and claims it's the northern tip of Terra Australis. 1523, we have our first globe that has four Africa, Asia, Europe, five of the 7 continents, 5 of the 6 hospitable continents on it, and we see that it also has this massive Terra Australis that covers most of the southern Pacific Ocean. And it kind of, in the 1540s through the 1560s, we see a series of maps being produced in France that have the same thing. And so just over and over again in this early modern period, you see major investment in trying to find another continent. And I think the big driver is that crossing the Atlantic.
Did they? Yeah, so I'm trying to think of Columbus's period in late 1400s. Then, did they think that was a piece of the South, or did they realize at that point? I can't remember if that was a
so they
continent.
eventually they realize, so Columbus lands in the Bahamas and on an island that he eventually named San Salvador. It lands in the Bahamas, and so we see subsequent expeditions from other early on primarily Spanish, but later Dutch, English, French. But all of them, what they notice though when they cross the Atlantic is there's 2 continents about the same size. I think there's about a 20% size difference in landmass between North and South America. But visually, if you don't have geospatial, satellite technology to actually calculate the landmass, once you see the size of it, it looks kind of similar. Well, and so I do think the sheer existence of running into this massive landmass has a great influence on it.
So, plus, map making in general has always been a bitch of a project.
Yes.
I mean, not only that, but a lot of people might not be aware that there's actually a paradox that occurs for map makers. I can't remember the exact name of the paradox, but it has to do with measuring the length of beaches. And essentially, the gist is, the more precise your measurement, the longer the beach is going to be. So, you could measure a beach. One map maker might measure a beach to be, say, 12 miles long, but then somebody else will come by and make a much more precise map, and suddenly that same beach is 15, 16 miles long, maybe 20, and so on, etc. And this can happen. Supposedly, it's essentially ad infinitum, so you can get these crazy problems like this. But then, again, just map making in general has always been a hell of a project to work on. I'm actually amazed that people were able to make maps even remotely similar to the way that the world actually is.
And when you look at it, wasn't until the mid 1700s that they could accurately describe longitude.
That's really fast. Because, honestly, I'm sure this has nothing to do with anything, but my mind just kept going to the Croatoan as soon as you brought up the issues with the maps and people having these weird beliefs about what to do in certain situations. But anyway, I don't want to get bogged down on my random thought. I'm very interested. Okay, so if this Terra Australis mode of thought that didn't really influence Columbus, you say, it wasn't.
No,
really...
I don't. And part of that is it's hard to figure out. So there are tons of books trying to figure out So Spain wasn't the first country Columbus went to with this idea that he could reach China. Henry VII in England had already turned him down. France had already turned him down. And so a common problem for historians of the early modern period, particularly of early modern Spain, is why does Spain say yes? Because Columbus's arguments only make a little sense. So Columbus's big issue. So we go back and we pointed out the Greeks knew the Earth was flat or was round. And so, the issue isn't Columbus proving the Earth is round. The issue is Columbus is miscalculating how big the Earth is. And so what we see is it's and this is why there's a near mutiny on Columbus's first voyage about 3 weeks before he makes landfall, because he should have landed by then, because that's how far off his calculations were. And so, yeah, there's that, but there's that common question of like, why does Isabel and Ferdinand say yes when everyone else says no? And part of that is well, Spain had just finished the Reconquista. The United Kingdoms of Castile, Leon, and
Wait, what was that? What was that first term you just said?
the Reconquista.
What is that?
So that is from about 800 to 1492, what we think of as Spain and Portugal, is in a constant state of conflict between several Muslim empires and the remnants of what was the Roman aristocracy.
Okay.
Eventually, these become, the modern kingdoms of Spain and Portugal. But in 1492, Spanish forces conquered Granada, which effectively pushed all Muslim forces out of the Iberian Peninsula. And so they called that centuries-long process the Reconquista, or the Reconquest. Okay. And so there's this massive, kind of proto-nationalistic hype that's happening in that moment. There's these two united kingdoms under the co-monarchs of Isabel and Ferdinand. There's the pushing, there's this religious fervor of pushing what they saw as Muslim invaders out of the Iberian Peninsula. There's a large influx of cash from that conquest. And so there's a lot of like other things going on as well that lead into that.
So I'm reminded of that story about or parable about knowledge, how to come to knowledge, where as different people are investigating an elephant, right? And each person sees only a piece of it. So when you've got exploration coming down from here. Mm-hmm. This way, you're gonna catch a piece of Africa, and someone's coming over from this side, you're gonna catch a piece of the other side of whatever, India. Mm-hmm. and so Australia itself kind of came together initially thinking there was one piece of land. I'm going to bring up a map here since you already got to 1600. I got a 1570 map.
Yes, this is one of my favorite maps.
Which there is no Australia, right?
Yes.
So if you're coming down from Spain, and I wish I could do pointers here, but you're gonna hit Africa if you come. Mm-hmm. Well, they didn't go around they didn't go through the Panama Canal at this stage, but obviously if they went west, they're going to hit North and South America. So
sure. So mid 1400s, they crossed the Cape of Good Hope and enter the Indian Ocean, so the southern tip of Africa. And so these first expeditions, that's the way they're coming. After, in the 1500s, as Spain starts developing colonies in the Caribbean and in Central and South America, they develop what becomes known as the Manila Galleon, which is which was their trade fleet that went from the Philippines back to Spain, and crossed the Pacific that way. And so after that, you see them going down south around the tip of South America and then into the Pacific. What you will see on using the map you put up, which is really a good map for showing like what this early modern world looks like, On the left-hand side, you'll see kind of a big island, likely listed as Nova Hollanda or New Holland. And so
Is
that
that the one on the left from
Yes.
the Antarctica, next to
Correct.
top of the Antarctica? Okay.
Correct. And so that's Australia, which it's first called New Holland because the first European to land there is William Johnson, and he claimed to have found Terra Australis. And so we have that first moment where Australia and Terra Australis kind of become the same thing. And then we see, and so the Dutch kind of send several expeditions to that area, but they never think of Australia, or in their case, what they're calling New Holland. They're not calling it Terra Australis, they're calling it New Holland because they don't think this is it. It's clearly not big enough.
So at this point in time, we've come from Spain around tip of South America, and we've hit this piece of land that's Australia, or Australia and New Zealand. So they think that's the east coast of it. And they've gone south and then east around the Cape of Africa and hit India in that area. And if they've gone south of India and continued east, getting into Indonesia and those South Asian countries, they think that maybe those lands are going to connect up.
Yeah, actually, in a lot of cases, they just genuinely believe that. So, Abel Tasman, so the guy that Tasmania is currently named after, so in the 1640s, he lands on New Zealand's west coast. But he had also, a couple years before, had sailed off of Chile and found the island of what we now call Espiritu Santo. And he thought those two lands, so the islands of New Zealand and this island off the coast of South America, he thought those were just the eastern and western edges of Terra Australis. And so it's useful to point out, though, that a lot of this continent they think sits in the Pacific. Well, the Pacific is larger than all of the Earth's landmass combined. If you were mapping it on a globe, its widest point is something like 185 degrees, which is really important because that means you can't accurately map it on a flat surface.
But they're not knowing that at this point.
No. Well, they have an idea. I mean, we've had calculations of the size of the Earth dating back 3,000 years. And so that's true.
They did have the circumference,
And so there is that. But yeah, it's the same thing that like they're just kind of sailing into this water, and every spit of land, they try to talk to someone. We have repeated journals entries from explorers going, I communicated with the natives by use of my hands and other signs, and they told me that there was a great land to the south. And so we see repeatedly that explorers will go, well, the natives told me Terra Australis is just to the south. Never mind that there's something like 25,000 islands in the Pacific. So chances are the land to the south was land, just another island to the south. And so we see like in 1605, this guy Pedro Fernandez Queiroz does the same thing, where he goes and he lands in, I think, what we would think of as New Caledonia, and they see that, and he says, oh well, I talked to the natives. How? I'm not sure. He doesn't go into that detail. But he goes, I communicated with the natives, and they told me Terra Australis was to the south, so I found it. But then if you look, well, a little bit to the south of where he's claiming to have found it is New Zealand, and that's a lot bigger than the island he landed on. And so you see that kind of over and over again, where it's like you're saying, we get bits and pieces of information, but it takes centuries. And so this is also during the period of the scientific revolution. This is when Europe is going through its wars of religion. This is as the colonies in the Americas are established and then eventually become countries in their own right. And so I usually use 1820 as the end point for Terra Australis, because that's when Europeans discover Antarctica, and so it's useful to this is the moment they have found the actual southern continent.
I'm sorry, give me that date again.
1820.
1820. Okay.
Yeah, which is
that other
well
map had
within
Antarctica
modern.
on it, though.
Say what?
I'm not doubting you. I'm
No.
confused because the other map that we just saw from 15 something or whatever had a giant Antarctica on it.
No, it had Terra Australis on it.
Is that what that on the bottom? That's supposed
Yes.
to be a that.
Terra
Oh,
Yep.
so they had no idea that was an ice wasteland.
Yeah, and you could see how far north it goes. And so that's and so in a lot of ways this map it's the history of Australia, it's the history of Antarctica, it's a history of much of the South Pacific. But yeah, and so that giant landmass that's Terra Australis.
So back to the elephant metaphor, if we look at the spot of Antarctica that is below Indonesia area, they thought that was a piece of the land too.
Yes.
Right, as well as the piece of Australia on the very left side of the map. So they're hitting all these different places and it kind of thinking it's all one piece because they literally haven't gone around it yet and mapped around it.
Yeah, and so one of our most famous explorers coming from England when we get to the mid to late 1700s, James Cook, when he's sailing on his second expedition to find Terra Australis, he actually at one point dips into the Arctic Circle, but he doesn't find land, and he writes that he goes, "I keep hitting ice, and I think there's land here, but I've got to get past the ice." And then you start seeing this is the moment when he starts doubting it. So there's an interesting period between that moment in about 1774 when you start seeing the conversation shift, where you start seeing doubt for the first time that this continent exists.
Out of sheer curiosity, these explorers that found Australia, did they merely find it, or were they actually able to step foot? I'm sorry, not on Australia, Antarctica. That's what I had meant to say. Not
no.
Antarctica.
So that's and that's where 1820 comes from. Is that's the first time they stepped foot on it.
Okay, I didn't think that we were even capable at 1820. Like you were saying, the ice just being a significant problem. I just figured nobody. That's amazing to me that they were able to figure out a way to get through at least a couple of miles of ice.
Yeah. Well, and so it's and if you look at a modern map of Antarctica, there's a couple spots where Antarctica kind of juts outside of the Arctic Circle or the Antarctic Circle, and so that's kind of part of why they're able to do that is hitting the right spot. So like I said, James Cook actually dipped below the Antarctic Circle during his second voyage. And during that second voyage, that's when he starts doubting it because he sees just the sheer amount of ice.
It's the ice wall. Nobody's ever going to see what's behind it.
So this is getting back to the idea of how we have historically learned over time.
Yeah.
In general, I mean, this is the another example of us believing one thing. Well, I don't know if belief is the right word because we have a hypothesis that there's the landmass, and then you go out and investigate. This is the scientific method. The evidence starts to show you something else, and opinions shift because that's what the evidence demonstrates.
And that's the really interesting thing is how long it takes for opinions to shift. If we use England took over New Holland, the western half of Australia, in 1826? No, 1829. But they didn't rename that Western Australia until 1832. The colony that becomes the country of Australia doesn't receive the name Australia until well into the 1830s. In 1817, Lachlan Macquarie, the fifth governor of New South Wales, reads one of these explorers' books and goes, well, why don't we call ourselves Australian instead? And that's, it's not until this like early 19th century that you start seeing it popularized. So there is an almost anti-scientific persistence of this idea of Terra Australis that persists.
So when did they finally get around it and determine that this is a freestanding continent?
Yeah, so the first time Australia gets circumnavigated is 1801 to 1803. This guy Matthew Flinders does it aboard a ship called the Investigator, and it's a really interesting story. So he leaves out of Sydney Harbor, starts sailing north, runs into a French navigator under the exact same mission, but from France. And this is the rise of Napoleonic Wars. So we see France and England at different times are at war and are not at war. When they first meet, they're not technically at war, but the two may not have known that. But they stop and they anchor their ships next to each other, and they have like 2 days of sharing charts with each other, and then they continue on their way. And as Matthew Flinders starts sailing around the western edge of Australia, his ship's carpenter points out that the ship is actively falling apart beneath them. And the interesting thing, though, is at that point it was faster to just finish sailing around Australia to get back to Sydney than to turn back. And so he ends up becoming the first person to circumnavigate this on an actively sinking ship.
That's pretty wild.
Yeah.
So was this? I'm sorry, I was distracted for a moment. Was this a purely scientific voyage?
Yeah. It's his So all of these voyages, they're given instructions. So 1768 to 1771, James Cook has his first expedition, and he's given 2 sets of instructions. The first ones are to go to Tahiti and watch Venus eclipse the sun, or the sun eclipse Venus, and then the second one is to find Terra Australis.
Are these like aristocrats paying for this, or is governments paying for this?
This is the kingdoms of France and Britain and Spain and the Netherlands. Well, the Republic of the Netherlands, but and so this is state funded. It's so the interesting thing about the 1801 to 1803 expedition is. So Matthew Flinders eventually gets arrested by the French government on the island of Mauritius because he has the wrong passport, and he spends 10 years in prison, and it destroys him. When he gets out, we have records of his friends who say, "I met him 10 years ago. He's barely 40, and he looks 70."
10 years in a French prison today will probably still do it to him. They're nasty.
Well, and this was like, but anyway, it's so while he's in prison, though, he writes to this guy, Joseph Banks, who is, at the time, one of the most important men in Britain. Joseph Banks was the longest-serving president of the Royal Society. He handpicked the first 5 royal governors of Australia. He created the policies that led to the Royal Botanic Gardens in Kew. Which leads to this idea of the 19th century British Empire. So he's the one who starts arguing that they should take cinchona trees from South America and create plantations for them in India, because they can grow them to combat scurvy. And so like this over and over again, you see this guy's hands are kind of like in everything. And so Flinders writes to him, and 1, trying to get out of jail, but 2, he sends him his charts from his expedition, and he goes, Joseph Banks, here's the thing. I have these charts and these maps, and I think we should call this landmass that you call New Holland, I think we should call it Australia. Because he goes, Australia sounds like the other continents, so Asia or Eurasia, America, Australia. He goes, it sounds like that. He goes, And I think because this continent that we've been searching for, I think it doesn't exist. And Joseph Banks turns him down, and he goes, well, maybe we'll call it, we'll call it its original Terra Australis, but we can't call it Australia. That's not right. But Joseph Banks also has like a vested interest in continuing the search because he was on James Cook's first expedition as a botanist. And so there's this person who came back from this very famous expedition that blew up and is suddenly kind of, arguing that, well, maybe we should keep looking anyway, even though you're the guy who circumnavigated Australia.
This is a little bit of a tangent,
Mhm.
but I want to go back just a bit.
Yeah.
Can you say something about the origin and purpose of the Royal Society?
Sure. So the Royal Society is the premier scientific organization in the United Kingdom. It started out. It's one of its first presidents was Isaac Newton. So this was a major. So this was a major scientific expedition. In fact, James Cook's first expedition was jointly funded by the Royal Navy and the Royal Society.
Well, the kind of what I was trying to get to is, as I understand, and I'm not fully educated on this piece of it, but the history of the origin of the Royal Society is kind of one of those historical turning points where we are moving from philosophy, or natural philosophy as they called it, to more scientific, methodological.
Yeah.
And it was an attempt to be more evidence-based.
Yeah,
right?
yeah, and you see
Its
that.
members.
Yeah, and so the Royal Society in England is a product designed to look like the French Royal Society. And so we see that like a lot of European countries develop very similar societies to promote, and as a result, we see a rise in scientific study and a rise in empire building, a rise in nationalism, all kind of happening at the same time. Which is one of the things I've always been interested in, is this relationship between power and the production of knowledge.
And we've also got the invention or creation of sciences.
Correct.
Right, like
Yeah.
geology and geography.
Yes.
Say something about geography in this period.
Sure.
as a science versus a philosophy.
Sure, and this is kind of where one of the questions, like, so what does this mean in the grand scheme of things? Like, it's really interesting that this idea persists for centuries, but what does that tell us about the way we produce knowledge today? And so that was one of the things that I was really interested in. And in 1924, the writer Joseph Conrad, so Heart of Darkness Joseph Conrad, wrote an article for National Geographic, and this was in the period when National Geographic was switching from being a scientific journal to a popular medium that people can learn about geography. But he writes an article on what he sees as the history of exploration, and he goes back from the Middle Ages to his own time. And he goes, exploration happened in 3 phases. The first phase he called geography sensationalism, and he goes, this was the age of explorers and treasure hunters. This was the age when we just looked for treasure and we made up things, and that's all we cared about. He goes, there was no concern for the science of geography. And then he goes from about 1640 to David Livingstone's death at the end of in the 19th century. He goes, that's the age of geography militant. And the age of geography militant is, for him, the professional geographer. This was when the science of geography was more important than money. And, he's ignoring the fact that this is also when we see 19th century imperialism. This is when Britain becomes the empire on which the sun never sets. And then he looks at his own time, the time after David Livingstone's death, to when he's writing, and he goes, this is the age of geography triumphant. We've perfectly mapped the earth. And so now all we can do now is just retrace the steps of explorers. And the interesting thing is so that article came out in 1924, so almost 100 years ago. if you look at most histories of exploration, broad histories of exploration, they follow that same process. That exploration happens in 3 phases. The first phase is this period of kind of sensationalism, of fabulousness, of treasure hunting. The second phase is this scientific phase. And the third phase is post-scientific. Some of the more recent ones just move this into a phase of being space exploration.
Yeah.
But the interesting thing, though, is that like none of these histories, particularly in the last like 30 years, reference the fact that they're using Conrad's structure when they're analyzing the past. And so, to me, that's a very similar problem as explorers in the 1780s going, I'm looking for this continent that's somewhere in the Pacific that we've completely mapped. And so it's and so ultimately, like, so the question of how does this matter in today's structure is, having this moment of cognizant, critical, criticism of your source material. It doesn't necessarily, looking at the Conrad structure, it doesn't necessarily mean that's a bad way of looking at the past. But if you're not aware that that's how you're looking at the past, then you miss any changes in thought or changes in understanding.
Yeah, because when you're in the period you're in, you don't know that these other periods are ahead of you.
Correct.
I remember reading something, looking up for this show about the sensationalism period, geography sensationalist. Right?
Yeah, I think it's. I'm trying
and
to.
It was
it's, geography fabulous. That's it.
Fabulous.
Yeah.
Okay. The article mentioned that at times they just literally just drew parts of the map together where they didn't have the information. Well, this one's here, this one's here. We'll just draw a line between the two.
And so like, I pointed out that as early as like 1605, they had landed on Australia, but it's almost 1800 when they realized that Australia isn't connected to Tasmania and Australia isn't connected to New Guinea. In fact, a Spanish explorer on the Quiros expedition in 1605 crosses the Torres Strait. Torres is the guy who does this, and the strait's now named after him. But Spain keeps that record of that crossing hidden for another 150 years.
Wow.
And so there's also like intentional manipulation of scientific knowledge. And so it deals with this question of, is science humanistic or is science nationalistic?
Well, I mean, fact is fact. So it's it's how we progress through what we know. It's interesting to me that people part of this process is there's more connecting the dots early on. You don't have necessarily enough information to connect the dots.
Yeah, exactly. There's trying to find an answer whether it's technology or it's tradition or it's cultural understanding of how the world is physically structured. You see that over and over again where it's like, all right, well, what do we fill in these blank spaces with?
Right. And it does remind me then also of Thomas Kuhn's
it is. That's
science,
the paradigm shift.
Paradigm shifts. So, I'm thinking of continental drift as an example. We didn't really know anything about that at the time, Go ahead.
Oh, go ahead.
No.
I was just saying when it was first posited, he was laughed out of the scientific meeting. The idea of plate tectonics and suddenly it goes, no, that's exactly how the world works. And so you see over and over again just these moments where people go, I have an idea, or this makes sense, or going back to the beginning of our discussion, it feels familiar but isn't. Kind of as an aside, for example, like the moments of things that feel familiar but aren't. The first European description of a kangaroo happens in 1770. And the guy's sitting here describing it, and he goes, it looks like a greyhound, but not at all.
Wait, like the dog?
Like, yes.
Well,
Mostly because he's going for like
to compare it to. So.
Yeah, he's mostly looking at for the color and the shape of the head.
Well, how would you? I mean, because I remember.
He said it looked like it was about the size and color of a greyhound, but it had feet like a jerboa, which is this tiny little like mouse-like creature.
That I get.
Yeah,
that would. Oh man, to his credit, I never really thought about that. How do you explain a kangaroo to somebody that's never seen a kangaroo? That's, okay, fair. That's fair.
Or we see when they run into indigenous Australians, they go, well, we noticed they had body paint that was striped, kind of like the stripes on our military uniforms. So I think they must have been warriors.
Oh my gosh!
Yeah, with no way to prove that, no way to communicate that, but just like, the paint looks like a stripe on a navy coat.
So, what does that tell you about zebras?
Yeah.
They're very, very well organized, and they will attack you if you let them.
By the way, I just want to throw this out there real quick. We're running close to the end of the hour here, so if anyone in the YouTube chat has any questions for Ryan, or hell, even Phil or myself, by all means, put them in the chat, and we'll do our best to get to those. In the meantime, as an aside as well with this thing, I remember learning about like Sacagawea. This is totally Sacagawea and or not even Sacagawea. Maybe no, it was. I take it back. And going on this big long journey across the country, and just them describing shit that I grew up with, like possums.
Yeah.
They were trying to describe this crazy thing that was hanging from the tree, the possum.
Yeah,
I'd seen a million possums, but I can't remember how they explained it in the book, because in the class they actually read his notes to us, and I had a similar reaction to what you were just doing with this kangaroo. It's like, who would describe it like that? It's so dumb. So with the history of exploration, is there anything that we haven't quite touched on that you wanted to before we run out of time?
I mean, I think we've covered most of the things that like I had thought would be questions. But the big thing for me is it's looking at looking at this moment. So science as the continual pursuit of a more accurate understanding of our environment or of our world. You see this, but you also see that this isn't the progressive narrative of going from Newtonian gravity to Einsteinian relativity to Hawking's quantum physics. This is a period when there's lots of setbacks, there's lots of turnarounds, and there's lots of just general wrong assumptions because
political intervention and manipulation too. So.
So it's recognizing that science is as much a product of culture as it is a product of systematic investigation.
Yeah,
that's actually a fair point. Which ties into a question that we have from the audience, from Aaron, or Aaron perhaps. He asks, question, how do we avoid similar problems today? How do we not hold to outdated material or ideas? I mean that's a good question. I mean, how do I know that the any particular belief that I maintain is just a byproduct of this bygone era and I don't know it?
Yeah, and so this is why pushing for my own future job prospects, why history matters. So we are products of the past. Every cultural sign and signifier that we use to define ourselves comes from either our past experiences or the past experiences of those around us. But because we can't create a perfect representation of that past, we decide different parts are more important. We decide that different people are more important to remember. We decide that different moments have a greater effect. And so history is that that continual negotiation over what parts do we have data for, what parts can we prove, and what parts can we prove were most important. And so that's one of the thing is constantly being aware of the source materials that you're dealing with. If you're in science, what is so going back to Thomas Kuhn, what is this paradigm structure that you're working within? What are its flaws? We know what we know, and we know a little bit that we don't know, and then there's a lot of existence that we don't know anything of. And so recognizing that there are limitations within your own data set, within your own scientific structure. And so I think that's, yeah. Oh, go ahead.
I think it's important too to note that it is important to teach. Really, I think from probably middle school up, that science changes with new knowledge.
Correct.
Correct. On the religious apologetics side, we hear criticisms of science with the logic of, well, science used to believe this or used to believe that, and that's not true now. So why should I trust anything science has to say today? Which totally misses the idea that it's a good thing to update what you think is most likely true based on new information.
Yeah, and so
go ahead.
Oh, I was just saying, yeah. And so when you look at science as, it's not this moment. And so there's an interesting thing that using geography and exploration, there's an interesting notice that explorers have where they have to rely on their predecessors. So when Cook in the 1700s goes on his expedition, he's taking with him copies of the journals from the 15 and 1600s. But also, there's a certain amount of they also had to challenge their predecessors, because there's no point in exploring if you've got a perfect representation, and science as a whole, like, you've got to continuously challenge it. And that's a good thing. That's what it's designed to do.
If something shows that what you think is true is not, doesn't matter. And sometimes it takes very often it takes a generational shift. Like you say, the plate tectonics shift really took a generation of the current scientists who believed there was no such thing as continental plates. They really kind of never gave up on that, and it was really the evidence proved them wrong. But it was the next generation that kind of had that majority opinion, and science goes forward from there. Our collective knowledge. We've got a quest. Go ahead.
If we have a question, that's more important than anything I have to say. Let's hear it.
No, I'm curious, Caleb. What do you got?
I actually lost my train of thought, and I'm not saying that as an excuse. I legit forgot what I was going to say anyway.
I do that all the time. Okay. So a question from producer Wes. What's next? Do you think we'll discover much in the ocean still, or is the rest left to space exploration?
Oh, I'm very optimistic about oceanic exploration. Just in the last year, we found what's his face's Shackleton ship.
Shackleton from
Antarctica.
Antarctica Explorer.
Yes. During the heroic age of exploration. There are parts of the ocean that we have not reached yet, just depth-wise. We only understand, I think it's something like 20% of the life that we expect to find in the ocean.
Oh, wow.
But do you think we're going to find any more lost civilizations down there?
No, I don't think we will find lost Well, so the Pacific is weird. No, but like we've watched islands come and go in the Pacific in the last 5 years, because they're volcanic islands, and so they either grow up, or if the volcano that they're founded around moves very quickly or explodes very quickly, we've seen islands sink. And so there is a lot of like geographic changes happening, particularly in the Pacific, where there's a large number of tectonic plates that interact with each other. So I don't think we'll find like full-on lost civilizations. Like I don't think we're gonna find Atlantis, which by the way I think is off the coast of Crete, but that's neither here nor there.
You mean there's
Everybody's
no
got a
Aquaman?
theory.
Yeah,
no
no, well,
Aquaman?
there's a large hole where a volcano used to be off the coast of Crete, and so that's where that comes from. But no, I don't think we're gonna find Aquaman, but I do think we may find ruins of like land masses that ruins of maybe villages that were built on cliff sides that are no longer cliff sides.
That
also,
actually, that I never even thought about that, but that's actually a really interesting point that I'm surprised I haven't heard more about.
Well, it's like we found pyramids sunken off the coast of Japan, and there's an interesting debate over whether or not they're like man-made pyramids or whether ocean currents cut them up, cut these perfect geometric lines.
That's a tough pill to swallow.
Yeah,
Perfect.
and so
someone needs to get over there. Someone needs to do their...
And so I do think there's a lot, particularly in the oceans, but also like the Earth itself. I think like we've done a pretty good job of doing the outlines, but I think there's a lot of details that we don't know yet. And that's
I'm excited to see if anyone's going to start drilling again. I know the Russians made it like 16 miles or something like that, 15, I don't know, somewhere between like 12 and 20
Yeah, because
miles
the crust is only supposed to be like 30 miles thick or something like that. Like it's, comparatively speaking, real thin.
Yeah. Which is actually, just to... I'll leave us on a slightly fantastical thought that I look... What you just said there, the mantle, the crust, everything, it's maybe 30 miles. I'll round it up and say 100 miles just for the funsies. So 100 miles thick before it's just molten lava pretty much from there to the core and everything else. Everything's just like the sun, essentially. Yeah. And one thing that I find absolutely fascinating is we all learn in elementary school that this is very analogous to an apple. Yes. The skin on an apple. It really, really is. It is very analogous to that. And what I find absolutely amazing is that all of everything that we have ever known, all of everything, exists on the skin of this apple. Exactly. And it's so fragile. It's amazing that all life in the universe that we are aware of exists on this tiny film around this globe.
It is. And it's fascinating, and it does a lot to, like, as a human, make you feel special, because like you said, all the life in the universe that we know of exists on this apple.
Yeah.
On the skin of this apple.
Yeah.
Outside of, like, amino acids and things like that we
found in space, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, it is amazing. I mean, even with continental drift, subduction of continental plates and that is so slow a process that
it is.
Like, and we haven't lost history to that at this point. Give us another few million years.
The interesting thing is, I think it's in Western Australia. There's a mountain ridge where they found crystal formations that date back to like the first 500 million years of Earth's formation. And so, looking that we have that kind of geologic history and seeing that, again, on, the skin of the apple.
And that is unusual, because on that long a time scale, most of the continents have could have been subducted. I mean, we all know about Pangea, right? 250 million years ago, where the continents were all together. Yeah. Well, Pangea was like the fourth time.
Exactly.
Right? They came together, went apart, and that was only the most recent one.
Yeah.
I mean, one thing that this is maybe I'm asking the wrong people here. This maybe I should do this post show, but stromatolites. I'm thinking like the 4 billion year old ones or whatever, like the really ancient stromatolites that we have. How do those still exist if plate tectonics are? I mean,
it's and this is so Australia is. Geologically, Australia is the oldest continent on the planet, and that's how we judge that, is based on that. And so the only thing I could think is they're toward the center of these tectonic plates, so they don't change as much.
Yeah,
All right, fair enough. Yeah, maybe a question for a geologist, I would imagine.
Yeah, I was about to say, and that's
Yeah.
I was about to say, I'm fortunate that I do a decent amount of scientific reading as a historian of science, but that is one of my limitations.
Fair enough.
To my limited knowledge on the subject, it is that, like everything else in existence, nothing is absolute. So, not every surface that comes together disappears and rolls around into the mantle as cleanly as you might think. So there's going to be certain areas where there's more activity, certain areas where there's less activity, certain areas where a few things will last, and there are not many of them on this planet, right?
Yeah.
You look at the moon as an example, and you can see craters from 300 million years ago. You don't see that on this planet because there's been so much turnover, but there are spots, and scientists love to find these things, right? Spots where there's more fossils that haven't been destroyed. Places like you just mentioned, Caleb, are pretty rare. So it does happen. It's not a perfect process. Well, Ryan, this was interesting. I mean, I one thing that intrigues me is people like you that get very interested in a very specific subject.
Oh yeah.
And I love the idea that when we have that someone can have the opportunity to get educated on something like that and follow that as a career. I mean, it's a big world and there's a lot to know, and some very important things we know because just a few people got very focused on a specific subject, and I thank you for that, for your
thank you for your
interest.
time.
Okay, Caleb, anything else before I wrap this up? I've got a couple little announcements to go.
No, by all means. Thank you, Ryan. I too want to thank you for your time. You're very well spoken, and as always, well, I say as always, because all our shows are entertaining, but you are no exception. You're very, very entertaining and very educational as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the time. Always a pleasure.
So everybody, definitely like and subscribe to Skeptic Haven. Like this video right here. Want to give you a reminder of a couple of shows that are coming up that I think are important and are going to be something you're going to want to know about. This Saturday, June 18th at 4:30 Eastern, we have a show centered around the Clergy Project with Lon Ostrander and Dwayne Grady. Clergy Project is literally one of the best organizations in the secular industry. So you're definitely going to want to show up for that. And then on June 20th, 8 p.m. Eastern, this is next week's sunny spot, Grief Without Religion with Seth Andrews and Candace Gorham. Definitely, anytime you've got Seth, you've got a terrific show. Please join us on that one next Saturday, 8 p.m. Eastern. Quick shout out to the producers. I've got everything listed here now, so I don't forget anybody like I did last time. Producer Wes, everybody knows and loves. Sunny Shell, Kat the Humanist, Cindy Plaza, and Courageous. And special thank you to our patrons, Kathy Cotton, Cindy Plaza, Bryce, happy birthday, Bryce.
Happy birthday, Jenna, Bryce.
Happy birthday.
Jena, Miyu, Deborah Grace, Sunny Shell, and Aaron Coalson. We will see everybody here next week, same time, same place, Secular Soapbox, and thank you for your attention.
Bye-bye.
Losing time, I'm fading fast. I just wanna make it last. Try to let go of the past. I close my eyes, embrace the blast. Sleepless nights and headache stack. Restlessness to hell and back. What's my purpose? What do I grab? A slippery surface, a heart attack. And sometimes you just gotta believe there's something that'll give you relief. There's something that'll have what you need. What you need. We're broken, it's tragic. We're not all elastic, but maybe there's magic. Believe you could have it. And I know of sadness, the anxious and panic, the infinite vastness of all that is black.